This lecture is going to look at totalitarianism, particularly fascism in Nazi Germany, and the rise of Hitler. In order to understand the context of Hitler, we need to understand the term totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, as we've seen with Stalin, applies to a variety of different regimes and has a certain number of qualities associated with it. So for some of you, this may be a refresher. You'll see part of this in your textbook, part of this in what we talked about with Stalin. But totalitarianism, in part, requires the mobilization of the entire population. That's an important part, that it is not just simply part of the population that is involved. It's not just part of the government that's there. It is every aspect of society is mobilized towards or by the government itself. And that means that everybody has to support the state and the state ideology. Typically, this means that there is a push towards or a mandate towards having simply one party and one leader. So you've seen that with the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, with Stalin as the leader. We'll see that with Mussolini in Italy, and you'll also see that with Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. And everyone has to support the state ideology, and everything is geared towards promoting that state ideology, as you will see. So this part here just simply describes the overall view of totalitarianism, and then we're going to see how that is applied by Hitler as well. Totalitarianism, because of the total part in it, also implies complete control over individual freedoms and rights. That is, people lose a whole series of freedoms and rights in service to the state, usually put in the terms of for the betterment of state, or the good of the state, and themselves by extension. Oftentimes there is a push to repress certain groups, such as labor unions. We see that in Nazi Germany particularly, mostly because they tend to be at odds with the goals of the state. As we'll see, again, even though the Nazis, when they come to power, say that they are a workers' party, they are in fact not really that. They simply use the name. But the idea is that you can't have any groups in society protesting what's going on, because you want to create a sense that everyone is believing and acting in the same way. So having differences of opinion, particularly political opinion, is not good. How do they achieve this? Well, in part it has to do with how they consolidate their power. As we've seen, all the way back to the French Revolution, as we've seen with Napoleon, and we've seen with Stalin, there is a definite reliance upon secret police. So you can have a variety of secret police who are maybe infiltrating crowd scenes or political speeches, maybe just simply acting as informants. But the idea is that there is a group of people there who are constantly watching you. There's also usually groups, either the secret police or others, that are involved with significant amounts of violence, particularly early on, against those who would oppose the totalitarian regime. So we saw that with Stalin. You see that to some degree under the French Revolution. We'll definitely see that with the Nazis. There is also the use of propaganda via the media, and usually what happens is that the totalitarian state ends up controlling most, if not all, forms of media, and then they disseminate that propaganda, which then gives a sense that everyone is on the same page regarding the goals of the state. Of course, they have to eliminate criticism, and that can be euphemistic in more ways than one. You can simply eliminate criticism by getting rid of opposing forms of media, or, as we'll see with the Nazis, for example, you can eliminate criticism by eliminating the critics, in that sense, killing them. The other way to approach this, too, or another way to approach this, is the idea of unifying the populace through fear and threats. And this is most easily done by identifying a nemesis, some sort of either individual or group that is responsible for, or that can be blamed for, not actually responsible for, but that can be blamed for all society's ills. The Nazis very effectively do that by singling out particularly groups such as the Jews, but also they will point to communists. Communists under Stalin will point to capitalists and fascists. In the French Revolution, they would point to counter-revolutionaries. So there's always this idea that you unify the people together, saying there is a group that is out to get you, and we are here to protect you. All right, so let's start then by looking at totalitarianism Now, the examples we're going to look at are fascism, and that's going to be in Italy and Germany, or I'm mainly going to focus, almost exclusively focus, on Germany. So you have a reading from Mussolini about what fascism is, but we don't really have time to get into Mussolini's part. You can read about him in the textbook. That's why it goes as far back as 1922 when Mussolini comes to power. Hitler, for the most part, we're looking at is 1933 to 1945. All right, so what exactly is fascism then? Well, first of all, if we turn to the definition of it, or the most widely accepted definition, it tends to be a very conservative, reactionary, and anti-communist totalitarian regime. It exalts the nation or the race above the individual. It equates the nation and the state as one. It centralizes authority in a single figure, so Hitler or Mussolini. It engages in a very strict government-led economy known as corporatism, and stresses loyalty to the leader. Examples then, other than Germany, would be in Italy and Spain, but there's a whole series of fascist governments across Europe and Latin America during this period. I should point out too that with Mussolini, Mussolini really has the origins, or is sort of the origins of the term fascism. It comes from the term fasces, which you see under number 1 there, the first one, fasces. Fasces, and you can see them depicted on the right side of the screen. These were these were objects that were carried by Roman administrators back during the Roman Republic, and it is a bundle of rods, which you can see, and it's kind of hard to see, but in the center of it there's an axe head attached to it. There's actually a lion's head above it, but in this one it's a series of rods and axe heads that symbolize the power of the Roman magistrates, and they were carried in processions through Rome by individuals known as lictors. The lictors would carry these over their shoulders, and that would announce the arrival of the individual, who in this case was a consul. And that person, through the symbol of the fasces themselves symbolized the power for physical punishment. That was the rod, so you could beat someone for infractions, or capital punishment. You could execute them. That's what the axe head was. Since Mussolini was Italian and fascism originates there, it was his version of fascism was much more about the resurrection of the resurgence of an old or a new Roman Empire. And so that's why he sort of clung to this image as an idea that would represent fascism, because it has the sort of militaristic aspect to it, the punishment aspect to it, but it's very sort of regimented and organized. All right, so how does this come about? Well, many of these individuals were not necessarily dictators that took over in coups, although some of them used illegal methods. Many of them, particularly Hitler, actually ascended to power legally and often had a wide basis for support. So it's not simply that they overthrew a government and took over. Many of them were brought in by the government that was there when they came to power. And so we're going to really be looking at why people supported them, particularly young middle-class men, especially in Germany. So some of the causes then that take place during this time are things like social upheaval. Why did these individuals come to power? Well, there was a lot of social upheaval that was caused by World War I. In the period after World War I is often referred to as the Age of Anxiety, which was in part concerns over modernity, things like for example, a lot of them could point to the new roles of women, the fact that in many areas women were now able to vote, and not just in Europe, but in America as well. Women were, God forbid, wearing shorter skirts and bathing suits in public, and then drinking in bars with men. These were things that challenged the older, more conservative approach to sort of society. But it wasn't just concerns over modernity, but there were also lots of strikes and the rebellions. A lot of middle class and the elites feared their countries were moving towards socialism, the idea that they somehow would lose control of the means of production. Fascism then ended up being an alternative to communism for them. And that was something that they favored. But there was a lot of changes sort of politically, there was changes economically and socially, and all of those really created this kind of anxiety that everything had really changed after the war, and a lot of people wanted to return to what they considered good old traditional values. That's one aspect. There was a lot of political disenchantment as well. People blamed not only World War I for all the problems they were facing in the 20s, but also the recent chaos of what they blamed on democratic regimes like the Weimar Republic. Many thought that the democratic process hampered progress and effectiveness, that is, too many people were able to vote. Um, when able strongmen like Mussolini or Hitler came to power, people were willing to give up freedoms if they believed that the ruler would be effective in either restoring order or restoring order and restoring the traditional social structure, what they felt safer with. There's obviously always the issue of nationalism that never ended after World War I. This continued to be strong in spite of the problems it had caused, such as a war, especially for those countries that had been defeated, like Germany, or felt they'd not gained enough recognition. So many new leaders, like Mussolini and Hitler, claimed that they could help bring their countries back to greatness. Notice all of these things have to do with problems that they're facing then, and the idea is not that we are going to move forward and embrace these and improve society, but we are going to return back to some sort of golden age. In many cases, a mythical golden age, where apparently everything was great. Um, but you cannot overlook the economic decline. After World War I, many countries faced a significant economic downturn. Production levels were down because the war was over. They didn't need the factories producing as much. There's a lot of rebuilding that needed to take place in Europe. All of this is made worse by the stock market crash of 1929, which ended up spreading economic depression around the world. Um, because of this, a lot of Europeans rejected liberal economics or free trade, saying it had caused the problems. So for some, the solution was communism, but this was a doctrine, as I pointed out, that didn't really appeal to the upper and the middle classes. So they instead advocated what was known as a corporatist structure, and that's a structure that de-emphasizes class struggle. And what it does is it forms interest groups that are based on occupation. And the idea is that they'll all think together as their occupation, sort of their mindset, and then that is tied to their obedience to or loyalty to the state. And the idea was that then the government would then regulate the economy, ensuring that no one interest group got too powerful. So in the corporatist system, there are still private enterprises that take place. So it's not the full form of communism where all of that disappears. It's actually much more. It is much more regulated, but you still have private enterprise. You still have capitalist businesses that exist under fascism as well, and they're supported by the state. All right, so that's the end of part one here. In part two, then we're going to look at how all those policies in general then influence and are used by Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. So pick up part two, which comes next.